You know, when we look at past history of royal history, it does, as they often say, doesn't it, repeat itself. You know, you look at the royal stories of old and you think, well, that happened before, and we've had playboy princes and difficult queens demanding courtiers, staff that thought they were above their station, you know. And it's an interesting thing because in this job you do get to meet quite a few of the staff that suddenly become more regal than the people that are actually the real royals. Trust me, if you met them off camera, you would literally be amazed. They expect a car. They almost expect you to bow and curtsy as they walk in the door because they've been near what they call the sort of, you know, point of power. Forgetting, of course, that they were actually just an employee. And like everybody else around the royal circle, once you leave, you leave. And very quickly, sadly, you're forgot because there's a new guard. I mean, it's just the way it goes. But also when you look at historical events throughout the royal calendar, I'm always fascinated to see exactly how certain things planned out and the way that they did. And really, when you look at, say, behind the scenes of the royals, what's really appertaining to their stories is you don't realise how much the government play a huge part in making those decisions, particularly way back in the 1930s, during the debacle that was Edward and Mrs. Simpson. You see, the government were very powerful then, as were the newspaper barons of the day. You know, they were just as big as any influencer now, whether that be Google, Facebook, Substack, YouTube, you name it. These press barons controlled the world because they decided the narrative that they were going to put out there on the pages of their big selling newspapers. And when you consider like a recent newspaper, say, thing could in that particular period in the 1930s sell 8 to 12 million copies a day, a very strong influence they had. What's fascinating when you dig further in is the story of Edward and Mrs. Simpson is one that's been gone over many times. But this little gem I discovered all the while looking in some government papers, and I wanted to share it with you. As ever, let me explain. See, looking at the government papers, what you realise, and in particular looking at the sort of press coverage of Mrs. Simpson of the day, you don't seem to think that, you know, I guess we all thought she was painted in a very bad light. But actually she wasn't, you know, they were quite deferential towards her, seemingly because His Majesty the King, as he was at the time, Edward, well, you know, really they didn't want to offend him. He was the king. At that point, people had a lot more power. And Mrs. Simpson herself was often described over here in the British media as simply a socialite and, you know, married twice and that sort of thing, you know, escorted the king to this or assisted with that. Over in the European press, they were far more salacious as they are today and literally highlighted the fact that, you know, she was never away from his side. Now, many years ago, I was taken to a small house just around the corner from Millbank in the heart of Westminster. And the owner of that house told me that in there was where exactly the rehearsal speech that the king gave about abdication took place. We know it didn't finally take there, but they rehearsed it many different times. And the reason behind this was that the government of the time, including the British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, just kept tweaking this particular story and saying, no, you can't say that. No, that will frighten people. Even Winston Churchill, which was part of the opposition at the time, basically said, no, you know, we're not having this, you know. But truly what was going on behind the scenes was even more fascinating because according to those documents, you see, the king himself, that's right, he thought that things were all going to change at the 11th hour. And it wasn't going to be his family that saved him. It was these particular people that in fact were going to turn it around so that he could get his own way. You see, while we all think of Mrs. Simpson as being madly in love and wanted to take on this particular role, according to the sources, no, she didn't really. And what she was hoping that would happen would be that the government would persuade him to stay on as king and they could still have a relationship, but not the sort of relationship that he wanted. She could carry on with her life and then predominantly everything would just be smoothed over. But you see, the king was so convinced that eventually things would turn around. He basically started to descend over to her apartment designers, major designers, couture designers of the day to make sure that she had the perfect dress for the coronation. And this is truly what's now in the documents. And it's interesting to see exactly how the government dealt with this because you see, ultimately, the public purse would have to pick this up. That's right. And when you think about that, how that would play out today, it's incredible to think, isn't it? That, he was so sure. But here's the reason behind it, you see. While she obviously loved things like jewels, makeup, fine dining, and of course all the good things in life, which were very much detailed, she truly believed, well, maybe I will win this out in the end. Maybe he will stay on as king. And she wasn't keen on that either, but she didn't really want to offend him, knowing how delicate he was, and more importantly, how very quickly he could lose his temper. Now, what happened in the government papers and behind the scenes was that, they were told that the king believed if he announced this, there would be an uproar, and more importantly, the public wouldn't let him go. He was that popular. He was the playboy prince that had charmed everybody through the First World War, and now he was here for them. And if he couldn't have the woman he loved, well, what was the point? So even as he was going off to make the broadcast, he assured Wallace that once that broadcast came around, the government may have to quickly get on board and reiterate the fact that he was going nowhere, staying there, and more importantly, returning back as king. That's how confident he was. So much so, there were 3 dresses in the end made, oh yes, and paid for, we're not quite sure what happened to them, that were apparently in line to be worn at the coronation because she wouldn't be allowed to wear naturally the sort of full robes and regalia. Fascinating to think, isn't it, what goes on behind the scenes? Now, of course, we all know that never really happened. And then what truly happened was he had to resign, and he had a life literally ostracized for many years. A life that he was never really fully comfortable with. And people still had to refer to him as His Majesty, and of course on occasions as Mom, etc. to her. He felt that they'd been wronged, and in fact, if people had listened to him, he would never have had to resign. And we, of course, in our history, would have never ended up with such a superb monarch as Queen Elizabeth II, reigning undisputedly and professionally and, well, with supreme elegance for over 70 years. Now that truly is one for the history books. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.